If I came out to you as a man, would you accept me? I mean, that would never happen. Who wants to be a man anyway? Did you know that one of the hottest things you could do in America right now is be transgender? There's been a lot of conversation about the twink to doll pipeline, and someone's got to get to the bottom of this. And I'm here to have that conversation. No, we're not going to be doing that at all. I wish. Actually, in this video, we're going to watch a video by one of my favorite OG trans creators on YouTube, Julie Vu. And she had a lot of things to say about apparently the trend of being transgender. But I'm getting ahead of myself. Hi, my name is katblaque, and I like to think that I make content for introspective hot people. And if you're here, I'll assume that's you. And if you're new here, you know exactly what to do if this video pleases you. Click that button and join us over here on the channel. So I saw this video a little while back in my feed, and I kind of wanted to respond to it, mostly because I have not made a lot of content about the topic of detransition, and I think that it's one of those conversations that is very commonly misunderstood. Detransition is one of those topics that I have sort of avoided because I know that there's people who feel very, very strongly about it. But it is a topic that comes into my feed quite a bit, and I figured that this would be a video that would actually be a great foundation for that conversation. As a transgender woman who came out many, many years ago, the very concept of detransitioning is very baffling to me. Now, I'm going to start out by saying that I have no ire towards Julie Vu. Julie Vu, like me, is an OG trans creator on YouTube. Julie Vu, for a long time, has been at the top of the game. The thing I respect about her the most is that she, like me, has sort of kept doing this thing, this sort of social media influencer thing. A lot of transgender YouTubers come to the platform, they make their content, and then really they disappear. Sometimes they simply move on to other things. Other people go stealth and no longer want to create YouTube videos, and others actually detransition and no longer want to be in the public eye. Over the years, I've known several people like that, and I can say that I can count on one hand the amount of transgender creators who have been regularly making content as long as I have, with somewhat of a large following. And so it's been really cool to see her grow and become such an awesome creator. Now, I don't know if this is a new thing that Julie Vu has been doing, but she occasionally talks about certain hot topics on her Instagram page. And this video that we're gonna watch is one of those videos. So I'm gonna pull it up right now, and I'm going to give you guys my response. I've got a little bit of a strawberry banana drink over here. Let's get into this video. This has the subtitle on it. It's the delusion within the community. Let's watch.
This is going to be controversial, but someone needs to say it. In recent years, there has been a lot of cases of people detransitioning. As a real transgender woman, I've noticed that my gender identity has become a trend. And so you have these confused people who are lying to their daughters saying, I'm trans. No, you're not. They got on hormones, they got on the surgery table, they get the surgery, and then a few months later, I regret this. Excuse me? You regret this because you're not really trans.
We're gonna respond point by point. I definitely think that there were a lot of eggs that cracked during quarantine. A lot of people, when they were by themselves, recognized that when they were not under the pressure to put together a certain boring uniform every single day to go see their classmates or their workmates, that if they were by themselves for a little bit longer, maybe they would reach for something different, right? Maybe they would reach for a little bit of makeup if they were designated male at birth. Maybe they would, and some of that, those little things may have encouraged some people to explore their gender. And here's the big difference, I will say, in how a lot of transgender people express themselves now versus way back when I first came out, is there are far more people who identify as some form of non-binary, gender fluid, or not quite here or there gender-wise. That is definitely far more popular than it was back when I came out. So let's talk about detransition, because it's a topic that honestly I struggled to understand at first, because just as a concept, it's something that I would never do, right? I worked very, 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 very hard to be in the position that I am now. I love my body as it is. Yeah, maybe there's a few things that I would change here and there, some major, some not. But ultimately, I'm happy. And detransition is just something that I could not comprehend for myself. That being said, I think that when we talk about the rate of detransitioners, we have to actually define what that is, because detransition can be defined by so many things. For some people, detransition is just no longer taking hormones. For some people, detransition is actually shifting their gender in a different direction. For other people, detransition is absolutely stopping hormones and no longer identifying as a gender other than the one that they were assigned at birth. It has a lot of different meanings. Some people detransition because they live in a conservative town where they're going to get harassed. Some people detransition because that's the only way they're ever going to be able to get a job. Some people detransition because they have a religious family who is not going to accept them and they want to be closer to their family, right? People detransition for a lot of reasons, and some of those reasons aren't actually that they're not trans, right? And so I think it is important when we talk about the rate of detransitioners to really recognize that a lot of those people don't actually feel how you are assuming that they feel about their gender. A lot of people will describe detransition as something different, right? It's not always permanent. It usually is not. And it's not always somebody shifting their gender in a very drastic way. Now, I have never really loved the concept of transitioning being a trend, but let's really talk about what I think a lot of people like Julie Vu mean when they say this. For a very long time, being transgender was a very binary affair, right? If you wanted to claim yourself as transgender, and even better, a transsexual, one of the true transsexuals, one of the last true transsexuals, you had to be a person who identified with maybe the most severe side of the gender binary. When you would go to therapists, they would ask you questions about, are you attracted to men or women? And if you said men and women and didn't just say men, there were some people who would use that as a reason to not give you HRT. Right? There are still some people who believe that if you are a transgender woman who does not have bottom surgery, you are basically just a cross-dresser. You're basically just a drag queen, getting up in yags every day, And personally, something that I have appreciated about getting older is how little I care about what other people are doing with their lives. I could not fathom giving a fuck about how somebody identifies, whether or not they're trans, to me, it's just a silly idea, right? It really is. I can't find the emotions within me to truly care about someone's gender in the way I care about a lot of other things. Personally, I don't need to understand your gender. You understand your gender. And if I'm going to be in community with you, I'm going to fucking respect it. But the thing I think a lot of people miss is that gender for a lot of people is fluid. It's not for me. My gender is not fluid, baby. My gender is definitely a solid state. But for some people, gender is very fluid. And I think for a lot of people, they sometimes need to dip their toes in a little bit to figure out who they actually are. And because gender transition in this country, at least, I can't speak to other countries, has been such a binary affair, the reality is that certain people who have wanted very specific access to care have lied, right? There are a lot of people who basically lie to their doctors because the standards that they are up against are honestly really shitty standards that were set by cis people. Let's just say they're designated female at birth, right? And they want facial hair because facial hair will give them gender euphoria. They may opt to take T, but they may tell their doctor that they are a binary trans man in order to gain access to it. Like, getting access to HRT is such a game of trying to basically prove yourself to a cis person. And I remember way back when I was first getting on hormones, I hated this. I was so desperate to transition that I did black market hormones. I was on the Yahoo groups, looking at dosages, it was a whole thing, girl. And I like that there are less people under that pressure right now. Are things perfect? Are they great for a lot of people? No. But I will say that I think it's a lot better now. Now, there are several people that I've known through my life who transitioned in a very, 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 very binary way. And then after they reached that point of like they did this thing with hormones, they did this thing with, you know, surgeries and such, they transitioned into the beautiful binary person that they imagined themselves to be. They got there and they realized, like, I'm a little non-binary gremlin. You know what I mean? Like, some people, once they really get to a point of like comfort with their bodies that allows them to feel more euphoric than dysphoric, for a lot of people, they get to a point where they're like, fuck gender. And there are some people who may define that as a detransition. But in all reality, it's somebody who is using HRT to shift their body around in a way that makes being inside of their body more livable. And personally, for me, that is not a bad thing. And I have a very hard time understanding why some creators like Julie Vu take such an issue with that. I understand the ire that some binary transgender women have towards detransitioners, because let's just be real about it. Detransitioners are quite frequently weaponized by the right? A lot of times people will roll out a detransitioner and say, hey, look at this woman who mutilated her body because of the gender ideology and the woke agenda. Okay? The woke agenda forced her to be this way, right? She mutilated, you know, they will do all of this shit. And then sometimes the detransitioners will be really, really all about telling people that access to hormones is wrong and no one should do it. And I understand why transgender people hear that and get defensive, because if you're somebody like me, you factually, objectively know that hormones saved your life. And it's frustrating that someone else had an experience where it turns out hormones weren't for them. It's sad that someone went down a path that they ultimately felt that they should not have gone down. But for people like myself, access to hormones and transition is the thing that has allowed them to be functional, right? I don't really know what I would do without it. Now, let's be real. You know, girl, I had a very good foundation before I took a single moan, BB. So I might be fine, but let's say I wasn't. Let's just say there's this stress that I used to feel that I no longer do. And it's crazy to think that someone else's poor decision would maybe take that access away from me. And so I know why people like Julie Vu feel a certain way about detransitioners and start having these conversations about transgenders, because for a lot of transgender women, for a lot of binary trans people, hormones really are life-saving, and anything that challenges that is obviously going to be met with ire. But here's the thing. Contrary to what the right would like for you to believe, most detransitioners are not transphobic. As you guys know, I am on TikTok. I be tickety talking sometimes, you know. God, that just made me sound so old. I'm on TikTok and I follow quite a few detransitioners. And I think what's a little aggravating about videos like Julie Vu's is that when I listen to the detransitioners actually speak about their own experiences, these were not people who typically, you know, went to the doctor, had a couple of conversations and got hormones the next day. They were people who were actually very similar to Julie Vu. They were people who identified themselves as very, very binary. Quite a few of them were, get this, Transmedicalist before they actually gained access to hormones.
Hey everyone, so I want to explain the transmedicalism to detransition pipeline and why it's actually very common. Transmedicalism is this belief that gender dysphoria is the one and only thing that defines you as trans. And if you don't have dysphoria and you're trans, you're accused of being a transgender who's just identifying as trans just to get attention and stealing all of the resources from the actual true transsexuals. At the end of the day, transmedicalism is just a way for that said trans person or gender diverse person to explain to cis people why they are trans. And honestly, it's a really easy and simple way of explaining your transness, and it is very cis assimilating. You're supposed to assimilate into cisness. You're supposed to blend in. You're supposed to be extremely stealth. And if you're not, you're just a transgender. You're just an attention-seeking person who's going through a phase and giving the trans community a bad name. And because you're transitioning or you're like explaining your transness just to get people's approval and validation, that can actually cause you to transition way too far, way too fast, in order to prove to other people that you're not crazy, that you're not one of those bad trans people. No, I'm normal, okay? I'm not one of those crazy SJW trenders. I'm a real trans person. I'm normal, see? And it's at that point, are you actually transitioning for yourself, or are you just transitioning so that you can fit into cis society, a society that's really not built for trans people nor gender diverse people? And actually me getting out of transmedicalist communities helped me determine which transition route is right for me, because it was actually the non-binary too cute community that actually showed me different ways to transition. And that if I'm like visibly trans, that's okay. That doesn't mean that you're a trender, and that doesn't mean that you're one of those bad trans people. It's whatever. It's cool.
The thing I really want to get across to people in this video is that a lot of these people, you know, they present themselves very much like most trans people who end up being binary trans people, right? They're not all these people who just turn their backs and say, fuck you to the trans community. They actually often still have a lot of empathy and support for transgender people. Most of them still do believe that transgender people should have access to care. They don't believe in taking that care away. For some people, it's that they wish they had a bit more time to really understand what HRT was going to do and what actually being a transgender person would be. Now, I know for me, when I was younger and I was starting to recognize that I was trans, it was one of those things where even though I struggled to find the language at first, once I figured it out, it was pretty much a solid realization that has not shifted since. But you know, I did, when I was younger, have a bit of gender exploration, right? I was always kind of androgynous, so it was pretty common for people to mistake me as a girl when I was younger. And I started playing that up, especially my last 2 years of high school. I had some fits, you all. I had some fits. Y'all couldn't stand me back in the day with my skinny jeans. Oh, girl. But anyway, something that I sometimes think about when we have these conversations about detransitioners is that I, maybe because of my situation, did not transition overnight, right? Like, I had my gender exploration phase where I was genderqueer, and then I went to college and it was like, oh, I'm just a woman, right? And I remember being kind of disappointed by that because low-key, I remember when I was younger, I did a lot of like research papers about queer people and stuff. So I was really excited to like be more interestingly queer. But when I went away to college, I realized that I was like just a woman and straight, and that was disappointing, but I'm glad I figured it out, right? But anyway, like, it wasn't overnight for me. And I think the process of me having to like really think about every step that I took did allow for me to feel more solid in who I am, to the point where I now don't fucking question it even a little bit. It would be bizarre for me to turn to you guys and say, oh, by the way, I'm not a woman. It would just seem outlandish and far-fetched to me.
I don't know what people think transitioning is like, but it's not taking pills, change your name, wearing extensions, and being like, I'm a woman, and your life and all your problems go away. Sorry, babes, that's not how it works. And do you know who gets yelled at? Me. I've had people go on podcasts and be like, Gigi Gorgeous, Julie Vu, glamorize being trans, and here I am, because they made it seem so easy. I've never held a knife to your throat and say, you have to transition. It's the delusion within the community.
When people say that creators like Julie Vu and Gigi Gorgeous glamorize being transgender, what they really mean is that they have a tendency to only show the glamorous side of it, right? Gigi Gorgeous is an absolutely drop-dead gorgeous woman. And she was someone who I think a lot of people, when they first started criticizing this idea of transgender women who glamorize being transgender, she's like the top person. I don't know what Gigi Gorgeous makes right now, but I know that back when I was seeing some of her content, a lot of her content was her being a rich, wealthy person doing rich and wealthy things. And Julie kind of also makes content like that. Now, someone who is in the audience who is unaware of what the average transgender person actually goes through can very easily look at their depiction of their life and say, wow, being transgender must be a glamorous experience. But the reality is, for these particular transgender women, they just have money. They just have money and they're able to have a glamorous lifestyle. But for the average transgender person, that is not the case. For the average transgender person, they will indeed live in poverty. And the content that Julie Vu makes, the content that Gigi Gorgeous makes, doesn't really ever acknowledge that, right? Now, personally, I don't think that it is their responsibility to, do anything more than what they're doing. I remember that I used to be one of the people who would criticize bloggers like this who didn't quite show the bad side of things. But I think my position on that has shifted because I think that there's not a lot of trans positive representation out there. And I think that we have a tendency to really want to show all of the trauma and sadness all the time. And I think we should. I don't think that we shouldn't talk about that. But I do think that bloggers like Gigi Gorgeous, they do provide a certain type of escapism that does have value, especially for young transgender people. So while, I guess it's not, the most real content that really shows what it's really like to be a transgender person, it is still content that I think has a trans positive impact. And I think for that reason, it is a-okay.
It's the delusion within the community. I'm sorry if I sound harsh, but this is the truth. Our gender identity has been made a mockery of because of people who are confused and do not know what they want. Whereas someone like me, I've always known since I was a child that I was different. You can't do drag a few times and decide, I kind of like this life. I'm trans. Also, I think a lot of people have very unrealistic expectations when they transition. They think once they take these pills that they're going to be all of a sudden a passable woman. I'm sorry, but that is not how it goes.
In this video, she mentions passing. And I know that for a lot of transgender women, passing is so important, but why is passing so important? Like, yes, it's important for you to feel beautiful and to actually look into the mirror and like what you see, right? But for a lot of people, passing is important because it's survival. Passing is important because it allows you to move through the world with a reduced chance of being attacked, right? That's just, let's be real about it. When you're a person who stands out, when you're a person who doesn't really fit into the binary, people often react towards you with anger, right? And so passing for a lot of trans people is safety and survival. There are quite a few people who transition, they go out into the world, and maybe they're happy when they're by themselves and when they're in their room and they're able to sort of express their gender in a way that feels genuine to them, but they go outside and get harassed for it. And some people just have to weigh whether or not they want to be a person who's constantly fighting for themselves in every space, or they want to be a person who's able to fade into the background. And unfortunately, I know that some of what Julie says comes from her personal intimate knowing of that, right? Like, I followed Julie Vu for a while. I followed Gigi Gorgeous for a while, right? Both of them at certain points in their life used to move through the world in a way that was a little bit more androgynous, right? And they did it in a very proud way at the time, right? It might have been the stepping stone to get to where they ultimately landed as transgender women, but they know what it's like to go out into the world as a person who is visibly male and also feminine, right? And so I know that for some of those trans girls, they really see themselves in other people, frankly. And that's when you get these projections of trans trenders and why aren't you trying hard enough? And I get it because it makes sense, right? As a trans woman, especially, the space that you have to exist in is often one that is so small, right? If you're a trans woman, you are often under the pressure to be beautiful, to be gorgeous, to be passable. And there are some people who just don't want to do that or will never be able to do that. For me, one of the early realizations I have that was pretty liberating was recognizing that women come in all different shapes and sizes. And sometimes when I listen to this type of trans woman, this like strain of trans women complain about, trans trenders and, detransitioners and things like that, it just feels a bit like, they are upset at trans women not adhering to a very particular silhouette. And that's kind of silly to me. That is kind of silly to me. Of course, you're not going to take a couple of hormones and, be passable overnight, but maybe that's not their goal. Maybe their goal isn't disappearing into the background. And sometimes what makes this conversation frustrating is that there is often this thread of, well, if you don't want to pass, well, why are you upset that people are mistreating you, right? And the thing about it is actually quite a horror to suggest to a person that if they want to be treated with common decency and respect, they need to have several surgeries, be on hormones for X amount of time in order to transition enough in a way that would sufficiently make other people comfortable with their gender. That's a bit much. And I think that for a lot of trans women, we've adjusted to that as like a reality or like a thing that we treat as a reality. And a lot of us know that if you look a certain way and if you pass, people will indeed treat you better, right? But that shouldn't be the pressure that everybody is under. That shouldn't be the reality that everyone has to exist within, right? Trans people should be able to be treated with respect without having thousands upon thousands of dollars of surgery. And I guess for me, when I think about stuff like this, I think that we would actually live in a much happier world if we policed gender a lot less and let people explore it as much as they fucking wanted to. And trans people have the tendency to do what a lot of minorities do, where if there's a person who is standing on a line or doing something that they shouldn't be doing, right? Not, being within the binary, how dare they? You're going to try to correct that because the idea is if this person embarrasses us, it's going to make us look bad. Now, girl, I don't know if I'm by myself on this, but I've never really particularly worried about what the other trans girl is doing because I always stand on my own 2 feet, baby, I've been defining myself since day one. I've defined myself quite well. People treat me quite nicely. So I don't really understand that. Don't understand that emotion. Don't know how that feels, but I understand how people like Julie Vu may get there because they have to deal with people having these issues with that type of trans person. And so their reaction is always going to be, well, I'm not one of those. I'm not one of those, transgenders who, breaks the laws or it cracks out of line. I stay in line, I'm perfect. Please don't hurt. It's one of those things, right? And, I think that when Julie said this, she really thought that she was being edgy. But in all reality, this is just what most people think. So I'm going to actually say something that is truly edgy. I think that people should be allowed to transition and change their mind. I think that people should be allowed to, if they think they might be trans, try it out and realize that they were wrong. See, the thing that gets me about this is transition is very personal. It's also something that's very physical for a lot of people if they're on hormones, right? And you're going to know if it's for you and you're going to know if it's not for you, right? If you're on hormones and you don't feel happy about it, that is a very clear sign that it's not for you. If you are on hormones and you're suddenly feeling at ease within yourself, that's probably a good sign that it's for you. I'm going to be really honest with you guys. As somebody who has followed Julie Vu for a while, there is something a little bit odd about her coming to an audience as a transgender woman who has had a certain degree of surgery, a certain degree of hormone, and turning to people who, by the definition of kind of what they're talking about, are at the very early point of their transition. and sort of suggest that they're delusional for being frustrated by the reality of what being transgender is for them in this exact moment. There are a lot of transgender people who detransition because it's hard to be trans. And then they recognize after detransitioning that they need to live their fucking truth. Most people who detransition will indeed retransition. This is not, something where all these people are just trying on a gender and then changing their mind and then detransitioning like all willy-nilly. Yes, there are some people who will detransition and will, recognize that they aren't the gender that they thought they were. But there are even more people who detransition because they're in a situation where in this moment, being out as trans is very hard for them, but that won't always be the case. I think my frustration with this video and a lot of videos online about detransitioners is that they don't really represent a lot of detransitioners. I think that we could stand to have more conversations with people who have detransitioned. I think that the detransition conversation is very negatively impacted by the fact that there's a lot of right-leaning people who want to weaponize that experience. And the people who don't lean into that often feel very, very alienated because they're also pushed out of the trans community. And for a lot of detransitioners, they feel kind of like they're on a deserted island where no one is ever going to really check for them unless they can use them in an argument. And for that reason, I really do think that if you're curious about what the lives of actual detransitioners actually are, I would highly suggest that you actually follow some detransitioners and hear what they have to say about their life as a detrans person. I'm going to link a bunch of the TikTok users who I follow who are detransitioners, who speak regularly about being detransitioners. And I think that you will be surprised by a lot of the things that they have to say. These are not on average people who didn't go through all the steps. These are also not people who were handed hormones very, very quickly. A lot of times, these are people who went through all the proper steps. They got on hormones the right way, and then they recognized that it wasn't for them or that their gender was not binary. At the end of the day, I really do think that these conversations should be between a person and their doctor. I don't really get why another trans person would care if someone takes hormones and turns out not to be trans. I don't really even understand the argument that it makes people look bad purely because how does this person not having a successful transition mean that my transition's not successful? That's the thing that gets me every time. A lot of this is based on the premise that we are still figuring out whether or not transition is something that trans people should be able to do, right? And I think that's kind of at the core of this. Julie is making this video because she's still trying to justify why it was okay for her to transition. And I guess to me, her living as a happy and productive transgender woman is proof that obviously transition works out for some people. Like a lot of medications, everyone has a different response to it. If one detransitioner invalidates every transgender person currently happily living within their gender, that means that the very premise at which we were functioning from is inherently flawed. Because in any other situation, a medication working for some people and not others would not actually be a reason to no longer use the medication. And I want for more trans people to start really questioning why they are living in a way where they are constantly pandering to cis people. Why do you need for a cis person to agree with you about your gender? Of course, I know the answer. Of course, we live in a situation where cis people will give you or take away your rights based on whether or not they do agree with your gender, but we should be fighting against that. We should be fighting against the very system that would even put you in a position like that. We should especially be fighting against a system that would require me to take a bunch of hormones and have a bunch of surgeries before I would be respected, right? That is a very terrible position to put any person in. And it's a position that a lot of cis people just are not and will never be in. I think that some trans people suffer from like the special kid disorder, like where they think they're so special, they're so unique, and seeing the new group of non-binary trans folks come out, especially after the quarantine, I think for certain trans people made it seem like, oh my God, everyone's just trying to capitalize on the trend. But the thing is, being trans is not a good trend. You know, like, yes, for certain people, being transgender will get you some sort of attention and fame or whatever, but like, it's usually not just that, you know, it's usually not just that, right? Like, you know, Julie Vu, she's not just trans, she's also gorgeous, right? She's also a good orator, right? Like, I would love for somebody to give me an example of a person who is purely famous because they're trans, purely on its own. If you can do that, then I will understand maybe where you're coming from. Like, a lot of people will just take what is annoying to a cis person and use that as a reason why someone isn't actually transgender, right? So a trans woman doesn't shave her face, well, that must mean that she's not actually transgender. Or she likes her facial hair. Or perhaps she can't afford to get rid of it in the way that you might have been able to, right? Like, it's aggravating to me sometimes that people feel so comfortable policing other people's gender in this way. And it will always seem like, I'm just gonna be frank, like not cute girl behavior. Anyway, on that note, I'm very curious what you have to say about this Julie Vu video, so please give me your thoughts in the comment box below. If you are a detransitioner, I would especially love to hear from you, so please feel free to leave a comment in the comment box below and share with me what you personally think about Julie Vu's video. Anyway, on that note, you are seeing some names of producers for my YouTube channel. Producers are my $20 Patreon members, and you may see some familiar names on that list, I'll just say. But anyway, thank you guys so much for supporting me over all these years on Patreon. It really, really does mean a lot. And I should be uploading a Patreon vlog by the time this video goes out. So keep an eye out for that. Also, check out this video over on Movies in My Closet. I think you might like it. On that note, I'll talk to you guys later. Anyway, as per usual, I want you to always remember and never forget that you are beautiful and you are loved. Bye.